So, welcome to the show, Dr. Abi Blakeslee.
Thank you, Luis. It's wonderful to be here.
I want to ask you about you first. I want to know, what was your path to discovering SE? What was your path to discovering somatic work in general and working with trauma?
Well, it all goes back to ice cream.
I love that.
So, so when I was young, one of the things that my parents said that I could get a Matterhorn, which is a big from Baskin Robbins. It's like a big sundae if I massaged them. So I decided that I was going to become a very good masseuse. And I do things like put dimes in phone books, start to feel for them to see if I could find the knot.
Mm,
I started to kind of have a relationship with helping people to unwind stress. And of course, there's a positive reward for
mhm,
a young child. But it became something that I think settled into my identity. I was also very body oriented. I was a dancer growing up. Um, and through my own trials and tribulations and traumas, we're often all the wounded healers, and that we go on this journey in order to find pieces of ourselves
mhm,
through adversity. So when I was in college, I moved into doing more body work. So that was my sort of entry point into working with trauma. And I got really curious about why it was that people would have a specific memory. Maybe they hadn't thought about it in 10 or 20 years, or they'd have a big emotional release when I was doing some sort of, deep tissue work, or
mhm,
an area in the shoulder would let go, and then something would emerge that was important. So this mind body connection appeared to me as something that I wanted to know more about. So a dear mentor of mine, I asked her, what book should I read? And she said, I think you should read Ram Dass, How Can I Help? And Peter Levine, Waking the Tiger. And when I was reading Peter Levine's Waking the Tiger, I just saw the importance of looking at the biology of trauma and looking at these sort of deeper states of it would call the evolutionary consciousness that is a part of us, but that is often unseen. But it really drives a lot of who we are or what we do, or even what decisions we think we make. And so there was this sort of, again, an awakening within me of curiosity. And I went into Dr. Peter Levine's program, the Somatic Experiencing program. I was in my early 20s. They call me, I'm a faculty member now. They call me that I was an SE baby back then. And I was very lucky. I was very fortunate to find this work when I was
mhm,
young.
mhm,
And I felt so engaged with it as a body worker. It led me to a master's in counseling and depth psychology, so
mhm.
Jungian psychology, and then from there to a PhD in clinical and somatic psychology. And I really started to interweave a lot of, the neuroscience research, the sort of up and coming information around the ways that we heal in with the somatic, um, I'd say, principles, which I always just continue to come back to over and over. And I use it for myself. I have 3 young kids now. So during the pandemic, right?
Mhm,
And
mhm.
have really had to stretch and grow in my own nervous system. So that's a little bit about how I found the work, and also, I think, in many ways, how I continue to find the work as we grow. We're always growing.
I think two things you said that really resonated for me was, I love that you were doing body work and you would notice touching certain parts of the body or certain shifts and sensations would awaken emotions or memories. So there was this real time discovery and curiosity of, oh, the body is actually bringing people to a sense of remembering, versus talking, right? It was like purely somatic in this example. And the way I found SE was the same thing. I had a toothache, which brought me back to a traumatic memory that I had completely blacked out. And I was doing psychotherapy and talk therapy and all these different kind of therapies for a year. And I just kept getting worse. Like my anxiety was getting worse because we were just identifying all the horrible situations, but there was no reflection back to the body, not to the fault of theirs. They just weren't trained to think that way. Uh, and so I found a somatic therapist and everything shifted because it was now coming back to, well, where is that in your body, instead of let's go to it in our minds and then our bodies think we're there and everything builds up again. So I'm saying all this because I've learned personally and then by training in the SEI community about the biology of trauma. But how do you describe it? How can you tell people listening what it means when we say biology of trauma?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a wonderful question. And let me just backtrack for a moment because we keep using this word somatic. And somatic means body oriented. And it also, soma is also the cell of the body of a cell.
Mm,
So if you look at the scientific literature, but somatic is body oriented. And I always talk about experiencing as a verb. So it's the experience of the body in the present moment. And this is a lot of Thomas Hanna and somatic psychology. There's a lot of different forms of somatic psychology, right? But the healing happens in the here and now. And that's part of the gift of this work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this theoretically. But the application is, how do we engage with our biology in the present moment to shift our state? If there's a state of fixity, to move it into more of a state of flow. Or if there's what we call dysregulation, we'll be moving more towards regulation and reorganization. Sometimes that's, in a very, you can feel it very tangibly, a big shift. Other times, especially when we work with syndromes or, really challenging pain pattern or early attachment wounds, it's like little by little drop by drop changes that over time increase and increase and increase until there's one of those larger changes in the state of the biological, let's say, um, memory. So let's talk about this biology of trauma, because when we work in somatic experiencing, we have a particular focus on the autonomic nervous system. The nervous system responds in various different ways around our life force. So we have on the upper side, like if you draw an up arrow, that's the sympathetic nervous system. It's for excitation. Okay? It could be positive or negative value. So, I'm excited to be here with you, Luis, right? So that's a positive value. So I have some sympathetic tone. I'm excited to speak to all of you out there and to share some of this amazing knowledge. And then, also, I'll bring up something that's happening. So there's a TikTok challenge right now. There's a whole kind of call for national violence in the schools. And we're holding our kids back from going to school today. And yet they really want to go because it's the last day of school and all the Christmas or holiday kinds of things are planned. So I feel some anxiety and some anger around that. That's would be a more of a negative value, right? So, but similarly, my heart rate is up. My blood sort of flows out from the core out to the periphery towards mobilization, both for talking, but maybe also some kind of action that I might need to take, right? So this would be sympathetic. Well, then we have a down arrow too in the nervous system. And this one's really important. This is for relaxation. It's the parasympathetic nervous system. So, within a certain range, we call it a soft range, you get this nice rest and digest. It's the kind of place where we're hanging out, we're eating our food, or maybe even you've had a really big meal and you don't want to talk, you just want to lay there, right? Lay on the floor and your stomach gurgles. It's also a place of good tissue repair, right? So it's really an important place of rest, rejuvenation, settling, calm. Again, it can have positive or negative, right? People say, I can't rest right now, I've got to go. Or they kind of drop into that place. It's like the where you drift off, you go deep into the parasympathetic towards sleep. Okay. So you can imagine throughout a day, we're moving in this range of excitation and settling, excitation and settling. And to a degree, we want some kind of shifting in our inner landscape to be happening. We don't want to be relaxed all the time, and we don't want to be excited all the time. Yeah, so you can maybe start to track, we call it tracking. You can track that in your nervous system. When is your heart elevated? When is it lower? When do you feel sort of like you're mobilizing towards something? So you might feel an expansion in your chest, some sort of like movement from the core to the periphery of power or energy, or a quality of fullness or vibration. Okay, so this is the way that the mind will interpret the nervous system states through sensation. Or you might feel a softening or a widening or a dropping that happens in the parasympathetic, a slowing, right? A relaxation, a giving into the felt sense of gravity, or you might feel heavier. So these would be different kinds of qualities of internal states that you can track just in a day. Okay. Now the biology of trauma here, we're talking here in this sort of like mid-range of responses. If there's something in the environment, and this is based on all of our biological evolution, it's something that we share with animals, which is also a beautiful gift of this work, right? Is that we can tap into, we call it the primitive or the instinctual self. So if something were to be real or imagined threat, my lower brain, not my upper brain, I'm not really thinking about it, will respond. It will give me a little bit of this burst of pay attention. Okay, so let's say I hear a sound, and the first thing that might happen is that I go into a bit of a startle response. Then after that, I'll have I'll stop my movement, I'll have a little burst of sympathetic, and I'll start to try to figure out what was that. The orienting response is a what is it response. So I might start to try to orient. It could be, this is a sound, right? So I'm going to be doing it through auditory, but it could be visual or gustatory or, your olfactory or, anything, scent, taste. And so I'll hear and I'll try to locate where was it. So I often will have a broad way that I'm perceiving, and then I'll narrow in on the location of where it was. So this is exploratory orienting, and then we move into more defensive orienting. And then we assess, do I approach, do I avoid? How do I respond to this? Now we have a couple of active ways that we can defend ourselves. If we determine that it's something we need to respond to, I might, if it's a social interaction, I might try to socialize. I'll use my call for help. I'll ask you, did you hear that? I will engage in some way, and maybe I'll scream, right? Or you'll have a conversation with someone about something that's relevant, okay? Then we'll move more towards fight, yeah, or flight. So those are active defensive strategies. A lot of the time, your lower brain will just pop there right away. There's not much you have to do, right? You're suddenly ducking under the desk, right? Or you've pulled back. That's a flight response. Yeah. Or you're kind of, puffed out and you're moving towards the fighting to find out if you can help. Or the disagreement. You want to get in there. You want to be able to help. So these would be autonomic responses, right? You're leaning in before you even know it. Now, another response that we might have is these are sympathetically dominant. Yeah. The social one has a little bit more of a dial. It's like, sometimes it can be more sympathetic. Other times I have to keep myself calm in order to communicate with you, but I still have some level of agency, right? Or there's a need that's there. But one of the things that we often don't think about, and this is one of the great gifts, I think, of the somatic experiencing work and other modalities that look at the biology of trauma, is that we also have a freeze response. And animals go into freeze when they're overwhelmed. This is a parasympathetic response. It's a heavy parasympathetic response. There's cessation of movement, right? So we're paralyzed. There's often a numbing response because we go into an analgesic. Sometimes there can be dissociation where we disconnect, mentally, not always. So this is this freeze response, low heart rate, low blood pressure, and any of these survival states are important. I want to be able to move through this in my physiology. I want to be able to freeze. I don't want to eradicate my ability to freeze, but I also don't want to get stuck in it. Nor do I want the next time something similar happens, my brain to sort. Oh, I froze last time, so I'm just going to go straight to freeze. Yeah. Or I fought last time and it worked well enough, I'm going to go straight to fight. Okay, so we have these patterns that can get stuck in the physiology, in the biological physiology, and a survival strategy that the lower brain starts to sort through. And we get stuck in these high, I'm going to call it high tone parasympathetic. So you can imagine that parasympathetic is turned all the way up. There's actually action in the parasympathetic that brings your heart rate down, right? That turns everything, mutes everything. Or we don't want to be stuck in these heightened states of sympathetic tone, right? My heart is racing. You mentioned anxiety. That's one, right? My heart is racing. My mouth is dry. There's fear and bracing, right? Or various people have anxiety. They feel butterflies in their stomach, or tension, or again, like that. It's a high sympathetic tone. So it's like, what is the felt sense of the fear? In many ways, that's the sympathetic nervous system. So when I work with people with anxiety, I say, that's a sympathetically dominant state. How interesting that your nervous system somehow got stuck in high sympathetic tone. What are we going to do about that? Do you have any? We could identify where that came from. We could do some work around it. But if we befriend it, rather than I'm an anxious person, right? Or I'm never going to get better.
Can we
A lot
pause
of the
there for a
time.
minute?
Yeah.
That's so like this is such a beautiful, thorough response. And this piece you're saying here, I think is so good for us to reflect on for a moment. Um, Befriending it. And you said it so well earlier, I wrote it down. Engaging in the biology of the trauma in the present moment. That's really beautifully said. Because when I hear you just say right now, it was answering a question I had when you said that a bit ago. If we're engaging in the biology in the present moment, what we're actually doing, or in my experience, what we're doing is we're creating a little space between us and the trauma response. And so when you say befriending it, it's really a form of self-relating, right? Like we're actually relating to this inner state rather than being driven by it or identifying with it. I'm so curious about what that means biologically. What happens in the biology when we're relating to it rather than being driven by it?
It's a great question. I've been looking at a lot of research recently on what they call interoception, and it was founded by a neuroscientist named Dr. Bud Craig. And interoception is conscious awareness of bodily sensation. So, for example, my hands are a little bit chilly. I'm up in the office. It's like 3 degrees in Montana right now. And this is the coldest room in the house. So, but when I started to talk about interoception, because I do sometimes, my awareness went more into my hands than they had been before. My hands were cold prior to that, but I wasn't paying as much attention to that. I've been feeling more of like my groundedness, like my consciousness has been with you, but also a bit more on my legs. Yeah. Because I get so excited when I talk about somatic work
Me
that
too. Me too.
I stay, right? It's like I'm like, stay grounded, stay present, stay embodied. Um, but I started to feel some of the coolness in my hands right now. Prior to that, so there's a place in the brain called the insula, in the insular cortex. So the insula will light up in a fMRI machine. So if they look at functional magnetic resonance imaging, they'll see metabolic blood flow exchange in the insula when I become aware of the sensation. But it's not there when I'm just having the sensation.
Oh, it's fascinating.
Right. So there's this bridge between consciousness. So it's like I might have a trauma response. I might be stuck in high sympathetic dominance, let's say. Anxiety. Let's stay with anxiety. But I'm not aware of it. But once I become aware of it and I stay with it, I companion it, and I notice what begins to happen next. Now, in SE, sometimes we also will invite people to stay on the edge of a sensation if it's overwhelming,
Hmm.
or maybe like we were talking about staying grounded. I might notice the weightedness or the quality of sort of coming into my sense of um, softness in my legs. And as I do that, I'm able to stay with more of the pulsing in my chest, right? So we create a stable enough environment. So it's not, we don't want people to feel overwhelmed by the experience of coming into themselves. Yeah. And much of the time we leave ourselves when we're very overwhelmed. So when we come back, we will find some of those cues of overwhelm. But then we track and we follow and we allow, what begins to happen next. It could be shaking or trembling or tears or heat, right? Warmth that spreads. Much of the time, we'll move towards self regulation as we engage with these internal states. So there's bidirectional, and this is coming back to your question, there's this bidirectional exchange of information from my body coming up to my brain. Am I safe? Am I in danger? Or am I in life threat? I call it neuroception. And when that neuroception a lot of the time moves into one of these states, we need to shift the state in the body back up to the brain to say, oh, I feel that trembling and twitching. I allow that to happen. And now I'm gurgling. Maybe everything is okay here.
Mm.
Maybe I'm not damaged, right? There can be all of these thoughts that also organize around dysregulation. Like, when you're tired and you're like, why am I tired?
Hmm.
Oh, it might be this. Oh, it might be that. Maybe it's this, right? We come up with all of these ideas,
Hmm.
but these can be deep self states about, who I am or what my limitations are. So I'll often say, like, if somebody's stuck in depression and they're having a lot of thoughts, I just don't want to be here. So, that might be that your body went into a state of protection through all the medical trauma you had, for example, right? Where you went into this kind of shutdown place in order to survive. And you still have some of that cycling around in your nervous system. You're in this parasympathetic state, which is kind of like thanatosis. It's like a near death state. We go into that place, tonic immobility, when
Hmm.
we're threatened. So instead of having that thought of, I might as well not be here, right? Or I'm broken or I'm damaged or whatever. Oh, remember that thought couples to a state of freeze. You could say, my body is in freeze right now. What is it that Luis or Abby or whoever, what is it from that podcast? um, what is it that I might be able to say? I'm in a state of freeze right now. I wonder if there's an exercise or something that I can do to help move me out of this state just a little bit. Yeah. And then we give some strategies for that.
Hmm.
But I really ask people to kind of pull that apart, we call it uncoupling,
Hmm. Hmm.
and look at my body did this in a situation in order to survive a long time ago. It was adaptive then. The challenge is that it can become maladaptive if that survival physiology keeps showing up or not discharging or releasing in a
Mhm.
way. It's like potentiated, we call it. And so we have different ways, including noticing your nervous system, befriending your nervous system, right? Tracking, following, grounding, allowing. And sometimes it can be helpful with a lot of complex trauma to have a guide with that at
Mhm.
first. But, teaching people strategies of how to be in their insular cortex and
Mhm.
in the allowing the shift to happen from the bottom up.
I find that part of this work the most life-changing, and life-saving, because when you're giving that great example about a freeze, and then this self state is expressing itself as like, I shouldn't be here. It's so interesting, when there's this interoception of noticing the freeze, and just in that moment that there's a part of me that can notice the freeze in that split second, that's what tells me I'm not the freeze. And then those thoughts that come up from the freeze are being witnessed again more than identified or adhered to or attached to. And that's what I find so breathtaking, because before that, personally for me, Resmaa Menachem has this really great quote that, decontextualized trauma in a person looks like personality. And that's what it was for me for so many years. Like fawning was my personality. And I didn't know that. And you were saying these words like autonomic, that's just a great way to say reflexive, or is you don't even have choice in the matter, like the body is choosing. And so there's these decades where our body chooses, like you're saying, this fixed response because it worked before, so it becomes like our low level norm, and it's a fixed response that keeps coming up, and we identify with it as who we are. But once we have this interoception, we can feel it as a sensation. We notice, oh, this is something moving through me. What can I do to facilitate it moving through me, right? Versus identifying and attaching it and sticking with it. Is that right? Is that how you experience it?
Absolutely. And so thoughts, prefrontal cortex, those can actually bind some of this survival biology.
Mm.
So we move into these states where we're actually keep them in place. So sometimes you also have to kind of, work with that. And I think this conversation that we're having hopefully will be um, inspiring to people to begin to kind of look underneath. I have that thought or I have that belief. What are the sensations that are underneath that?
Mm.
And then, what is the relationship? So we can follow sensation, right? Is it sympathetic? Is it parasympathetic in nature? If I stay on the edge of it and I companion it, does it begin to move on its own? Much of the time, if we're with one of these survival states for long enough, it'll start to move. It's almost like, when we have a cut, we'll heal. So we talk about something called self regulation and developing the capacity to self regulate. But if we don't ever pay attention, right, to something that needs our attention, or we never get that interoceptive interchange going on, these, wounds in a way will often not have the opportunity to reorganize. Yeah. So there's there's something that you're bringing up too makes me think of mindfulness, right? So there is a level of mindfulness in our work. So it's like I begin to consciously witness the I, right? And
Hmm.
I'm companioning or I'm with these states. One of the differences between mindfulness and SE, and this was one of my favorite questions in my dissertation defense that Dr. Danielle Siegel asked me, is what's the difference between SE and mindfulness? And I said, well, SE employs mindfulness. However, sometimes we might pay attention to something over another thing.
Mm. Hmm.
Yeah. And this is where we have a 3-year training program for professionals, from all different kinds of, whether it's body or mental health or medicine. We have a pretty wide group of people that we train. Um, but it's looking at, all right, so if there is a sensation of constriction and there's a sensation of a vibration that's moving through the arms, we might pay attention to the feeling of the vibration that's moving through the arms because it's a release, it's often a release pattern. Or if I feel a gurgling in my tummy, but I'm also feeling a cold, icy feeling in my back. For a little while, I'm probably going to focus on that gurgling feeling in my tummy because it's moving my system more towards regulation. I don't want to abandon the icy feeling in my back. So it's not about just following good, good, good,
Hmm.
parasympathetic, parasympathetic. It's actually about the movement between the two. But so many of us have lost the rest and digest. So many of us, whether it's through modern society, through all kinds of oppression dynamics and um, our own, personal and collective trauma, we really need aid to be able to kind of broaden some of those states. Now, some people who are shut down, they need more help kind of with upregulation. So we're going to help them to feel what? Vitality, agency, healthy aggression. You talked a little bit about fawning, right? It's like healthy aggression and expression and
Hmm.
boundary.
Hmm.
Like those are some of the edges of the work. It's about kind of potentiating more possibilities. So I think I wanted to bring that piece up because it's not only about following, it's also about choosing, where do I place my attention? There's lots of things going on in my body right
Hmm.
now.
I'm glad you brought that up, and I want to highlight that because I think one thing in my last I do a 6 week course. In my last cohort, one of the students asked, "How is this different from spiritual bypassing?" Right, and I think that's why I love SE so much because when you're practicing it fully in its full potential, there's no room to bypass. Because what you're really doing is you're creating capacity to be with the parts that you've been bypassing, right? So when you say that piece about, um, uh, I forget exactly how you said it, but going up and down, going between the two. Let's say there's sympathetic and parasympathetic. We're not just soothing people and living in the parasympathetic. We're also touching into the sympathetic using the capacity building exercises. So the sympathetic doesn't become threatening, doesn't overwhelm us, doesn't dissociate us. And relationally, I see that in a way like somatic shadow work. Like I'm letting myself be in touch with parts that I would normally um, completely drown out, let's say with alcohol or food or people or thoughts. But I can be with this part now because I have capacity to sit with it. It's really like it stokes like an unconditional love for all these parts of me. That's what I've noticed. So I'm glad you're saying that because I think that's what's very unique and beautiful about SC is we're not ignoring those other parts.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like the word that you use of the, somatic shadow, because
Yeah.
I steeped in Jungian psychology and and there is this kind of initially we're often helping people notice what's working for you. What did you do that helped you to survive? What are the things that your biology has done well? Right? So what are some of your the strengths, right? We kind of like a tree when a tree gets wounded, it will grow up around that and it will shape the tree,
Mm.
right? But it becomes part of it.
Hmm.
And this is very much true in our overwhelm responses or in our survival biology. It will help shape us. But then, we want to be able to look back and engage. Who am I? Where am I going? But for many people, it can be around a spiritual bypass. Like I'll only orient to the good. First, we try to create some of that sort of capacity, the feeling of the betterness, the feeling of the being able to regulate a little bit more. And then we say, what's distressing you? Where are you stuck in your survival physiology?
Mm.
Yeah. How
Mm.
are you suffering?
Hmm.
What do you think contributed to this pattern? As you think about that, what are you noticing in your body right now? What are the responses in relationship to that? Right? And then we can work with that signaling that comes up in the here and now to help it to reorganize. But, going back and forth between the two, we call this concept pendulation. It's the inherent rhythm of all things. So you can also look at expansion and contraction. Physics, right? The universal principle.
The heartbeat. I'm always thinking of the heart.
The heartbeat, right? The breath,
Mhm.
the nervous system, expansion and contraction. So we have biorhythms. We even have, the universe, the expansion of
Mm-hmm.
the universe,
Yeah.
all of these different, gases, soil dynamics.
Yes.
Yeah. I was like, had this feeling of granite.
Mm.
I used to be a climber. I haven't climbed for a long time, but a lot of that, the sticky rock, happens because of the expansion and contraction of the precipitation,
Mm.
right, in the
Mm-hmm.
rock face. So when we talk about pendulation, that's the movement that we want to have intrinsic rhythm. So much of this work is reinstating intrinsic rhythm that has it's been impeded, whether it's sort
Mm-hmm.
of cortical control or thoughts about ourselves, or it also could be that survival physiology that's potentiated that kind of just keeps looping around. And so we can engage it on that level and start to begin to follow, notice, allow, shift. But we don't want to avoid it. We want to also come into it,
Mm.
because if we ignore it, I often describe it as like when a baby is yelling and you just keep ignoring it, it's not going to calm. It might dissociate, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you respond to it. You go over, you pick the baby up, and you say, "Oh, honey, what do
Mm-hmm.
you need?" And then you start rocking and humming, or it's like you can sit on the yoga ball and do the bouncing, or you right, or you wrap them up, or you feed them, or change them. You respond in a way.
Mm-hmm.
We also need to be able to respond to our nervous system, to attune to that level of, where am I braced? Where am I fuzzy? Where am I soft? Where am I wavy?
Mm-hmm.
Where am I silky? Right? There's like a whole poem
Mm-hmm.
inside,
It
or
really
sometimes
is. It is a
like a
poem.
landscape.
It's a total landscape's the word I always use. And I love what you're saying because you keep saying here and now. And I think that's, to me, again, one of the most simplest yet profound pieces with this work is we're not giving clients affirmations to make them feel parasympathetic. We're noticing what's actually the reality of safety right now, and where can we feel that, and then use that to go to this other place that feels really hard to be with. And I just think it's kind of magical, and so practical at the same time. And when I was going through my hardships and I was seeking therapy and trying to learn, I noticed in the work I was doing, at least, there was all this orientation toward the vortex of the traumas, the eye of the storms, but um, there wasn't enough focus on how I survived them and to feel my survival so I could metabolize them. So when you're saying all this, it's nice to hear how you're teaching it and the words you're using. Um, they're soothing. They're like a balm, the way you communicate it and the way you speak about it. And I'm sure other people listening are feeling that too. And I think, again, the piece I just want to keep highlighting, we almost have to close, is the piece around, uh, we're not abandoning parts of ourselves. This work is really the opposite. It's about, how do I have capacity to be with difficult, unseen, unconscious parts of myself so that they may integrate and then I'm actually more fuller and more complete.
Yeah. Yeah. Do we have maybe one more minute, and I could invite people to try an exercise?
Oh, that'd be great. Yes.
And we can close with something useful. And so I'd like to combine what we're talking about with parasympathetic and sympathetic. So, what I'm going to invite everyone to do, and you can do this anywhere. So, you can do it when you're standing in line for, the grocery line, or you could do it when you're seated, but let's just start with a simple grounding exercise. Grounding is, to me, a felt sense of weightedness. So, where do you connect to the feeling of gravity? So for many people, it's their feet, their seat, or their back, but it could really be anywhere. And so allowing the earth to support you. So there can even be a metaphor of support, or being allowing, or feeling, being receptive to that quality. So just taking some time, and Louise, I saw you took a deeper breath. I feel my body slowing. Now, for some of you, you might actually find that you drop more into your body, so you notice more pain or discomfort. You may not go into the parasympathetic right away. That's okay. Just again, engage with the feeling of, hello, body. And you might notice if there's any quality in the weightedness that feels supportive or receptive. So from here, let's do one more thing. I'm going to invite you to stretch upward in some way. So we're on a podcast, so you can't see us, but I'm going to actually lift from my spine, and then I'm going to lift up, and then I'm going to stretch my arms up. But before I do that, I'm going to feel what happens right before I lift my arms up. So feel the organization towards movement before you even move, and how your body has to build energy to do that. And then allowing your body to do what it wants to do. You could stretch upwards or outwards. Noticing the space above and around you. And now see if you can feel that little bit of energy that your body has created. It's heat, it might be like a vibration or a sense of rhythm or flow. And at the same time, that support from the earth. And let's do that one more time, where you feel, come back into the feeling of the groundedness. And then here, let's just push out in front of you, like you're going to push your hand out in front and then move it to the side. Now use the feeling of the ground this time to kind of push forward, push out into your space, and then feeling that nice space around you. So there's both the quality of that groundedness and some energized movement.
It's so
So
profound. Yeah. Oh, sorry, please.
go ahead, Luis.
I'm just saying it was profound when you said notice the sensations before movement happens, what organizes before the arms even lift. And there was this beautiful, it was from the viscera of my solar plexus area, kind of tightening and pushing a life force to let this open. And then it moved up into my head and my hands, and it felt so beautiful, so alive.
Yeah, and so this would be an opportunity to feel your aliveness, right? And that's so much of also that, and like, I'm alive, I'm here.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
That's so
yes.
important when we work with the resolution of trauma. Yeah, and that vitality is often, it's right here. It's ready for us. It could be small for some of you. Remember, it's like could be little changes over time. And for some of you, you'll feel a larger amount of that as it cascades. So I want to invite everyone to get curious about your biology. Notice the expansion and contraction. Take time to feel into positive states. How do I know I feel better? How do I know I feel good right now? Or how do I know I feel less bad? You know? And then also tapping into some of those negative states or difficult states, companioning them, letting them move on their own. See if it begins to shift. Stay at the edge of it. Give it some time. And if there's a little bit of a shift towards feeling different, how do you know you feel different? Right? That
Mm-hmm.
kind of subtlety of paying attention it can be very, very helpful in the resolution of overwhelm and dysregulation towards regulation.
So beautifully said. And I love when you were saying, there's so much I loved when you were saying. I wrote so much down, so I'm trying to pick my favorite right now. But when you were just saying the piece about just the awareness of what tells me I feel good, or what tells me I have pain, even, that's a constant building of that muscle of interoception. and and what that really means to me, building that muscle, and when that becomes your culture and your lifestyle, where you're just in that interceptive place because of these rituals and exercises, then we're in that constant reminder that this isn't me, it's something moving through me. And there's such a beautiful freedom with that. Even when you said some of you were going to notice when you settle into the grounding, you're going to notice more pain or stress or anxiety or even panic sometimes, because that was already there, but there was a dissociation from it. I often tell people, when you start noticing more pain, it means you're doing the work right. Nothing's wrong. And it can be difficult if you don't have the capacity to be with that pain. So I think this exercise is a great way just to build very gently how to feel the goodness. If the pain is there, notice it. You talk about pendulation, pendulate between the goodness and the pain, so you have a little more space around it. But specifically, that piece around interception is so important to me, because I really see the body as a sovereign being. When we sneeze, we don't think we're our sneeze, and when we yawn, we don't think we're our yawn, but we think we're our trauma because of how trauma has been held socially. And this work is really pioneering in the way you're speaking about it, to help us learn and understand that it's the sovereign body doing what it knows how to do best for survival, and it's stuck on that. And so with our help and our companioning, like you said, there's this beautiful, like, stewarding of the body that occurs. And I think it's just a very sacred way to live. Yeah. I thank you so much for coming on. And I'm just wondering, as we close, if how people can find you, because people are going to want to find you after this, you know, listening
Sure.
to your talks or classes. How do they get in touch with you?
So there's two different ways to get in touch with me. One is through the Somatic Experiencing Institute. So that's SEI. And Somatic Experiencing International is where, been working globally for a long time. And we're continuing to expand Peter Levine's work. So if you go to traumahealing.org, you can find my email address, you can find more information about me. If you're a healing professional, you can join the training, which I highly recommend. I have trainings all over the world. Um, and there are other wonderful SE faculty as well. So you can look regionally to see who you're drawn to. And then also we have an SE directory. So if you want to work with an SE practitioner, or you find even somebody who's in the first year of the training who's near you, you can locate people to do some more somatic work. So that's another really nice thing to look into. I also have my website, which is abiblakeslee.com. I have some different workshops that are coming up. I have webinars and podcasts. I do a lot of SE consultations, so you would need to be in some kind of a somatic, program for that. And a lot of it's geared towards that. But if you look at both articles, you can find articles that I've written, and then any of the podcast webinars and some workshops are also available to everyone.
Yeah, I thank you so much for your contribution to trauma healing, and to coming on here and giving us your time so generously. Thank you.
My pleasure. It's been wonderful to connect with you all and with you, Luis. I appreciate you offering me the opportunity to talk about this important work.
You're so welcome.